The Fokker D.I and D.II were a couple of German biplane scouts that saw limited service with Die Fliegertruppen des Deutschen Kaiserreich between mid-1916 and mid-1917. Between the two, only about 260 were produced. They were plagued by poor design choices, poor construction quality, poor performance, and were from their outset substandard and obsolete, being barely better than the preceding Fokker Eindeckers. They led to a series of aircraft designated the D.III, D.IV and D.V, but time precludes their inclusion. In case anyone's wondering, the D.7, D.6 and D.8 are not part of that sequence, but represent two different development cycles. By early 1916, German air superiority had substantially eroded. Accordingly, Inspektion der Fliegertruppen, or Idflieg, the bureau of the German Empire that oversaw military aviation, issued a specification for a new fighter and asked all the major manufacturers to submit prototypes for consideration. Given the success of the Eindecker, Anton Fokker was reasonably expected to be among the first to contribute. He had, after all, cultivated Germany's fighter pilots and was well aware of their requirements. Basically, they wanted a small, fast, well-armed biplane. Unfortunately, Fokker had a bit of a problem with the requirements. He didn't have anything. He, or more correctly, he and his design team with Martin Kreutzer, had to start from scratch, and that presented some issues. At this point, it is important to understand that Anton Fokker was not really an aircraft designer. He had certainly tinkered with aircraft design, but he had no engineering qualifications. In temperament, he was really a test pilot, and in this he was assisted by pilot Bernard de Waal. Martin Kreutzer was a mechanical engineer, and at the time that he joined Fokker knew little if anything about aeronautics, had no previous experience with aircraft design, and little experience with a workshop. I think this shows when considering the events that follow. First, they needed an engine. This would, to a great extent, dictate the size and weight of the aircraft. Fokker, or his design team, or both, favoured the air-cooled rotary, and these had been used in the Eindecker. An obvious choice would have been the 160 horsepower Oberursel used in the E4, but while this had been capable of 110 miles per hour straight-line speed, feedback concerning its reliability and performance at altitude made it undesirable. Additionally, the gyroscopic effect of the heavy 14-cylinder engine, combined with the heavy handling of the wing-warping lateral control, made it less maneuverable than its predecessors. This is where things get somewhat interesting. Later in 1916, the Sopwith Company began development of the legendary but notorious Sopwith Camel, which likewise featured a heavy, powerful rotary engine with similar torque issues. But in that aircraft they were turned into a benefit, although one that took an experienced pilot to take advantage of. However, by this time most aircraft used ailerons for lateral control, which proves superior to wing warping and can only have assisted with handling torque. Team Fokker, however, preferred wing warping. The reason for this seems to me a bit peculiar. Not only had ailerons proven a better solution to lateral control, they were much easier on the pilot. Wing warping aircraft tended to be heavy on the controls, a problem increasing with speed, leading to pilot exhaustion, a combination that did not lend itself to maneuverability. It seems likely that Fokker knew this, and if not him, then surely his design team. However, in principle, wing warping was easier to implement, and allowed the structure to be simpler and lighter, and perhaps it is because of this that this means of lateral control was chosen. Fokker also thought that wing warping provided more positive control, but regardless, and perhaps more importantly, it was cheaper to manufacture. Nonetheless, at a time when other designers had switched to ailerons, this seems archaic and downright stubborn. A more suitable engine might have been the water-cooled inline Mercedes 160P, but most production was going to Albatros and thus largely unavailable to Fokker Flugzeugwerke. Additionally, it would have required a sturdier and therefore heavier airframe. Thus the only readily available and proven engines were the Oberursel U-1 rotaries developing 100 horsepower. This was the same engine that had been used in some of the Eindecker Scouts, and so was a known quantity. Curiously, the Oberursel engines were license-built copies of the French Gnome Delta, which makes one wonder if Gnome received royalties after the war. I would assume so, but given that Anton Fokker acquired Oberursel during 1916, and given his refusal to pay royalties on patents infringed by his company's interrupter mechanism, I would not be surprised if there was some difficulty over this. By this time, Fokker Flugzeugwerke's method of construction was well established, and persisted throughout the war. The fuselage of the new aircraft was of buck-girder construction using light steel tubing for the frame. The wings were built up of wooden ribs in a twin-bay equal-span biplane configuration. They were slightly staggered, with the upper wing somewhat forward of the lower, supported by 2 pairs of struts per side and a plethora of bracing wires between each wing. The result, as submitted for trials to Idflieg on 17th of April 1916, was a somewhat boxy-looking construction, capped at the business end with the distinctive semicircular cowl seen in the Eindeckers and a twin-bladed propeller. Armament was a single LMG 0815 synchronized with the somewhat reliable Fokker interrupter gear to fire through the propeller arc. The factory designation of this aircraft was the M17Z. I say somewhat reliable because that's more or less accurate. Without going into huge detail, let me just say that purely mechanical synchronization mechanisms were prone to failure through wearing of the gears, expansion or contraction of the various pushrods or drive shafts, and outright deformation of parts. While these would be improved upon, this early in the war it was not uncommon for pilots to shoot off their propellers, sometimes with disastrous results. It even happened to Anton Fokker during a test flight in front of an audience, although he managed to cover it up. The reason that 2 machine guns were not installed in the D.I or the D.II was that Fokker's interrupter gear only worked more or less reliably with 1. 2 machine guns significantly increased the chance of shooting off the propeller, and 3, as experimentally installed on the Fokker E4, was basically unworkable. At the same time that a prototype was being worked up using the Oberursel engine, a second was being developed that used a 120 horsepower Mercedes inline water-cooled engine. With a factory designation of M18E, it ended up quite similar to the M17Z with the exception of the nose, which looks better streamlined. It was submitted to Idflieg for evaluation on April 15, 1916. Armament was once again a single LMG 0815. I am incidentally greatly summarizing the development process of these 2 aircraft. This presentation is going to be quite long enough at this rate, so a more detailed account will have to wait for more subscribers who want to hear it, or I run out of aircraft to talk about. The M17Z and M18E were basically evaluated simultaneously. The M18E was redesignated the D.I. D stood for doppeldecker, or double-decker, meaning biplane, just as the E in the E series had stood for Eindecker, or essentially monoplane. According to Anton Fokker in his autobiography, and I quote, "In official tests the D.I proved to be the fastest and most efficient fighter available." The reality was rather more scathing. It was said that while it looked good from a distance, closer investigation revealed flaws in both the design and workmanship. It was recommended that Fokker take advantage of the advances in technology demonstrated by the Albatros D.I, of which he had taken a number of photographs quite against regulations. An initial order for 3 aircraft was received for further testing, but further orders were delayed until Fokker could demonstrate that the design issues could be resolved and that the quality of workmanship had improved. This latter issue, however, was to pursue him throughout World War I, to the extent that it is remarkable that he was allowed to continue production. The reason for shoddy workmanship can possibly be attributed to Anton Fokker's lackluster management abilities, penny-pinching, and the ramshackle nature of his factory, though he himself blamed poor materials he was forced to use during manufacture. I am not persuaded. Quality checks during delivery and manufacture could have resolved the issue. Certainly during D-7 manufacture, Albatros was able to produce under license considerably superior aircraft to those of the Fokker factory. Among the changes requested were ailerons, understandably, a fin in front of the rudder for stabilization, strengthening of the forward carbane struts, stronger bolts for the lower spar attachment, and strengthening of the control stick and rudder assembly. To what extent these changes were made I cannot be sure, although I doubt that ailerons were implemented immediately simply because it remained an issue in later D-series aircraft, as we shall see, and because I've seen pictures of the D-1 both with and without ailerons. I suspect a delay in their introduction. However, on the 6th of June 1916, the D-1 was passed as suitable for combat service, and the original order for 3 was amended to one of 80. It has to be noted by this point that the Germans were pretty desperate for something, anything, to counter the latest Allied aircraft, such as the Nieuports and the Airco D.I.II, which were much better than the Eindecker and False monoplanes. Unfortunately, the D-1 was not a suitable counter to these, and wasn't even as good as the contemporary Halberstadt D.II. In addition, 6 were apparently ordered by the German Navy, although there are no details of their use. Another 18 were ordered by the Austro-Hungarians and went into service as the Fokker B.III. These were delivered in August and September of 1916. A further 8 were built under license. Whatever limited potential was possessed by the D-1 was quickly eroded in the field when there were 2 instances of the wings falling off. Commensurate with this were wing failures of 2 Fokker monoplanes, and 3 other events that resulted in the aircraft being removed from frontline service due to deficient factory workmanship. The remaining aircraft were pressed into service with flying schools and other training activities, or placed into storage. It is probably best that this was done, as the aircraft was basically obsolete from the start. In truth, it was really only a little better than the Eindeckers, though with a top speed of 93 miles an hour, it was a bit faster. The story of prototype M17Z is somewhat better. Designated the D.II, testing revealed that it was a little better than the Eindeckers. Like the D-1, it was only a bit faster, but had an improved rate of climb, but again was not up to the standards of the Halberstadt D.II, let alone the contemporary Allied Scouts. To be honest, Idflieg should have simply ramped up production of the Halberstadts, but for reasons I have not been able to determine, did not. I can only speculate that Anton Fokker's personal positive relationships with pilots and command, plus the reputation of the Eindeckers, had something to do with this. After all, the man who could lay claim to the success of the Fokker Scourge could be granted some leeway, right? The D.II was approved for service, and 132 were ordered, with the proviso that later production employ ailerons rather than wing warping. Immediately there was a problem. The switch from wing warping to ailerons was probably one cause for a delay in deliveries, but more significantly, the Fokker manufacturing facilities were simply not capable of fulfilling the orders for both the D-1 and D-II in a timely fashion. As a result, while D-IIs were issued to frontline units, it was really too late, and not only were they surpassed by Allied aircraft, but also by the Albatros D-series coming online. Consequently, they were quickly withdrawn from service and saw utility as training aircraft, or on quieter fronts such as Turkey and Macedonia. At their peak, 68 were in service, but their numbers dwindled until by September 1917 there were only 10 still in use. That they survived that long is actually rather remarkable. In addition, 24 M17E prototypes were delivered to the Austro-Hungarians, where they received the designation the Fokker B.II. They served as trainers until 1918. D-1s and 2s began appearing on the Western Front in July of 1916, followed by the Albatros D-1 and D-II the following month. A brief comparison of these reveals that the Fokker aircraft were actually more maneuverable than the Albatros, but their rate of climb was significantly lower, their top speed was significantly less, and Fokker's quality of production issues cannot have made potential pilots confident in their new machine. Despite the design issues with the Albatros aircraft, they were preferred over the Fokkers. When the Albatros D.III was grounded in early 1917, Manfred von Richthofen switched to a Halberstadt D.II. A more interesting comparison is with the Allied aircraft they were opposing. For the sake of simplicity, this can be considered to be the Nieuports and the Airco D.II. Because the latter is a pusher, and quite a different design, I'll keep that one brief. In all honesty, except for its maneuverability, the D.II was quite similar in performance to the new Fokker Scouts. In its defence, by the time the Fokkers faced it, the D.II was approaching obsolescence, though the epic dogfight of 23 November 1916 between Leno Hawker and Manfred von Richthofen flying an Albatros D.II demonstrated that it was still capable in the hands of a skilled pilot. Curiously, the D.II was lighter than the Fokker D.I, and while heavier than the D.II, achieved superiority over it with a similar rotary engine, also made by Nomeron. The Nieuports make for more interesting comparisons, that is, the 11s, 16s and 17s. They and the Fokker D.II all use similar rotary engines, either variations of the Leron 9J or the Oberursel built under license from the same company. Horsepower varied from 80 to 110 horsepower. All were small, light biplanes, with the Nieuports being significantly lighter than the Fokkers. The Nieuports were also equipped with ailerons from the start. Now, granted, in the weight department they were sesquiplanes, with a smaller chord that can only have contributed to a lighter aircraft. Additionally, looking at them all from the front, it becomes clear that the Fokkers were of more draggy construction, having a twin-bay layout and all the struts and bracing wires that go with it, compared with the Nieuport's distinctly cleaner look. The result is that the Nieuports outperformed the Fokkers, even the Model 11, with its 80 horsepower engine. Clearly, Anton Fokker failed to meet his design goals. There are, I think, several reasons for this. First and foremost, and as I have said previously, he and Martin Kreutzer were not qualified aeronautical engineers. The success of the Fokker Eindecker can, at least in part, be ascribed to it being a variation on the Morane-Saulnier Type H with a lengthy 18-month development cycle. The D.I and D.II were the result of an accelerated development cycle. The insistence on using wing warping for lateral control, despite the rest of the world having switched to ailerons, possibly due to their manufacture being easier and cheaper. And finally, poor production quality. However, the Fokker D-series story does not end here. The direct successors to the D.I and the D.II are the 3, 4 and 5, which will be covered at another time. There are no known surviving D.Is or D.IIs.